Welcome back, Philosophical Lifer. In the hit TV show The Good Place, Eleanor Shellstrop, played by Kristen Bell, starts off as a psychological egoist. She believes that if you dig deep enough, you'll find that everyone has an angle. Everyone just does good stuff out of their own self-interest. In fact, there's a funny scene at the end of season 2 where Eleanor is trying to be a better person by serving with the group Clean Energy Crusaders. As she says to a fellow group member, quote, "I've been nothing but good for like 6 months, and all I have to show for it is this crummy apartment, a lawsuit, a loose caboose, and an overdrawn bank account. Being good is for suckers. What do you even get out of it?" The lead volunteer calmly responds, "A feeling of fulfillment in your soul." In frustration, Eleanor responds, "Gross. That is the grossest sentence I have ever heard, okay?" You might have even entertained psychological egoist reasoning in the past, as I have. Someone does something morally good and you wonder, they probably just did that because it makes them look good. Or maybe it just gives them that gross sense of fulfillment in their soul, to paraphrase Eleanor. Now, what's wrong with such reasoning? Is psychological egoism defensible? Or is it pretty bad when it comes to a theory of why people do things? Today, we'll answer these questions. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. Hi, I'm Dr. Christopher Kloos, founder of the Philosophical Life. Today is the 8th episode in the Exploring Ethics series. We're working to cover through an excellent intro text. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing and clicking the bell to not miss any future videos. Now, let's jump in. First, we want to distinguish psychological egoism from ethical egoism. In Plato's Republic, Glaucon plays the part of a moral skeptic. He reminds us of the story of Gyges, a shepherd that discovered that magical ring. It's a ring that can make a person invisible if you turn it one way. And then the person could do whatever they wanted without being detected. Now, Gyges used the ring to very devious ends. He went into the royal palace, seduced the queen, killed the king, and then became king himself. With this in mind, Glaucon conducted a thought experiment. Imagine there are 2 such magical rings. One is given to a virtuous person, and the other given to a scoundrel. If we could follow the 2 people around to see what they did, Glaucon argues that they would both do similar things. The person of virtue would use the ring to self-interested ends. As Glaucon explains, quote, "Now no one, it seems, would be so incorruptible that he would stay on the path of justice or bring himself to keep away from other people's possessions and not touch them when he could take whatever he wanted from them from the marketplace with impunity. Go into people's houses and have sex with anyone he wished, kill or release from prison anyone he wished, and do all the other things that would make him like a god among humans." End quote. Not only would the just or virtuous person do such things, Glaucon thinks he ought to do them. This highlights the difference between psychological egoism and ethical egoism. In his paper, Ethical Egoism and Moral Skepticism, philosopher James Rachels argues against both theories. Now today we're going to focus on how Rachels argues against psychological egoism and claims it's not an acceptable theory. What are the 2 theories? Psychological egoism is a theory about how we're actually motivated, like what makes us want to do what we do. It holds that all acts are done either only or ultimately for the sake of self-interest. Psychological egoism is an empirical theory. It's a theory about the psychology of people as they're motivated to do what they do. By contrast, ethical egoism is a normative theory. It's a theory about what motivations people ought to have and what they ought to do as a result of those motivations. It holds that an act is right for a person to perform if and only if that act is in the person's best interest. In the second part of this 8th episode of Exploring Ethics series, we'll discuss ethical egoism in depth. Why start with the empirical theory then? Why does Rachel spend a large chunk of his paper arguing against psychological egoism? Now, the relationship between the 2 theories is important to cash out. If psychological egoism is true, That might lend support to ethical egoism. Now, whether ethical egoism is true does not depend on whether psychological egoism is true. That is, ethical egoism could be true even if psychological egoism is false. This comes out as Rachel characterizes ethical egoism, quote, "It's the view that regardless of how men do in fact behave, they have no obligation to do anything except what's in their own interests. A person is always justified in doing what's in his own interests, regardless of the effect on others," end quote. As you can see in that quote, apart from how people actually behave, they have no obligation to do anything other than what's in their own interests. Yet, if it turns out people actually always do what's in their own self-interest, that might, with further arguments, lend support to the idea that that's how people ought to behave. But how they ought to behave doesn't rely on how people actually behave regarding whether that's true or not. Claiming otherwise would commit the famous is-ought fallacy of trying to derive a normative claim from an empirical claim. Now let's look at two arguments for psychological egoism. The first one involves the claim that all acts are selfish because they pursue the strongest desire. In filming this video during the COVID-19 global pandemic, times are hard. Imagine that you lost your job, which many people have. It's a struggle to make rent. Out of the blue, a friend offers to help you cover your rent. She's employed and wants to help out. Isn't this an unselfish act? Doesn't this show that people don't always act out of self-interest? According to this first argument for psychological egoism, supposed voluntary acts of kindness, like your friend covering your rent, are not unselfish. Your friend is just doing what she most wants to do. If she didn't most desire to help you, she wouldn't have helped you. And your friend doing what she most wants to do is just acting in her own self-interest. So people only really are motivated to do stuff out of self-interest at the end of the day. Now we can make this argument more precise as follows. Premise 1. Provided that an act is done voluntarily, the agent always does what she most wants to do. Premise 2. Doing what one most wants to do just is acting in one's own interest. That is, acting out of self-interest. So, conclusion, the only motive from which anyone ever acts is self-interest. Do you think this is a good argument? Rachels doesn't think so. As he says, quote, "This argument is so bad that it would not deserve to be taken seriously, except for the fact that many otherwise intelligent people have been taken in by it," end quote. Now, why is the argument so bad according to Rachels? Let's dive into that. Rachel's first objection to argument 1 is that people don't always act based on their strongest desire. Rachels identifies premise 1 in the argument as problematic. It's false that all voluntary acts involve people doing always what they most want to do. There are two types of acts that aren't done because they're what the person wants to do, much less what they most want to do. What makes an act selfish is not whether the agent wants to do it. What makes it selfish, if it is the purpose or the goal of action. Now, in the first category are acts that are means to desired ends. Now, you may want to not get a physical. In fact, they can be pretty unpleasant, but they're a means to maintaining good health. You may not want to go to work on Monday. Yes, maybe somebody's got a case of the Mondays, but you need to work as a means to keeping your job and earning a paycheck. Yet, an egoist might respond that the ends are wanted, so we're still acting in accordance with what we want. If the egoist makes this move, she still has to deal with the second set of acts. The second set of acts are acts believed to be obligatory, and sometimes people do things out of obligation. They don't want to perform a certain act, and there's not a goal that they want to achieve as a result of the act, but they feel obligated to do it and do it for that reason alone. So imagine your friend borrows your car for the weekend. Sunday night rolls around, she's exhausted from the weekend, and the last thing she wants to do is return your car. Yet, she promised she'd return it Sunday so you can have it for work during the week. But wait, couldn't the egoist respond that you want to keep your promises, so you're still doing what you want to do? Rachels argues this won't work. As he explains, quote, "If I have promised to do something, and if I do not want to do it, then it's simply false to say that I want to keep my promises. In such cases, we feel a conflict precisely because we do not want to do what we feel obligated to do. End quote. Your friend returning your car is like this. She doesn't want to, and yet she feels obligated to. And she does it despite not wanting to keep her promise. Now, Rachel's second objection to argument 1, here Rachel strengthens his case against argument 1 for psychological egoism. For the sake of argument, he grants the truth of premise 1, namely that everything people voluntarily do is what they most want to do. Then he targets premise 2. Recall that premise 2 equates doing what you want to do with acting out of self-interest. So let's return to the case of your friend paying your rent because you hit hard financial times. Imagine that your friend wants to pay your rent to help you. Does the fact that your friend wants to do this mean she's acting out of self-interest? Rachel's doesn't think so. If your friend enjoys helping her friends, even when it means sacrificing her own finances, it doesn't follow your friend covering your rent is acting out of self-interest. Your friend's act is not motivated by self-interest. It's motivated perhaps by a desire to promote your well-being, which is connected to your ability to maintain steady housing. As Rachel's concludes, quote, it is the object of want that determines whether it is selfish or not. The mere fact that I am acting on my wants does not mean that I'm acting selfishly. That depends on what it is that I want. If I want only my good and care nothing for others, then I'm selfish. But if I also want other people to be well off and happy, and if I act on that desire, then my action's not selfish. So much for this argument. End quote. If the object of my want is the good of another person, then I'm not acting selfishly. I'm not acting on self-interest alone. And this undermines premise 2 that holds that doing what you want just is acting out of self-interest. What do you think about the doubts Rachel's raised to premise 1 and 2? Do you find his counters equally plausible and effective? If not, how might an egoist reply to Rachel's? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Now, argument 2. All acts are selfish because they aim at the agent's self-satisfaction. This argument might be dubbed the Rolling Stones argument. As Mick Jagger laments in their famous song, I can't get no satisfaction, and I try and I try and I try, remember that? That reminds me of the Maroon 5 song, Moves Like Jagger, featuring Christina Aguilera. Anyway, argument 2 holds that all we desire to do is achieve self-satisfaction, a pleasant state of consciousness. Going back to your friend helping you pay rent, the object of your friend wanting to help you is that nice state of mind. The real goal isn't bringing about your good for you by helping you keep a roof over your head. The real point of this supposed unselfish act by the do-gooder is, well, feeling good. It isn't to help others. More specifically, this argument for psychological egoism goes like this. Premise 1. So-called unselfish actions always produce a sense of self-satisfaction. Premise 2. The sense of self-satisfaction is a pleasant state of consciousness. So, conclusion 3. The point of the action is to achieve a pleasant state of consciousness. Now, argument 2 reverses how things actually go. Rachel's thinks. We don't want to get a sense of self-satisfaction and then find different things to do that achieve that pleasurable state of mind. Instead, as Rachel's argues by way of illustrations, quote, we desire all sorts of different things. Money, a new fishing boat, to be a better chess player, to get a promotion in our work. And because we desire these things, we derive satisfaction from attaining them. And so, if someone desires the welfare or happiness of another person, he will derive satisfaction from that. But this doesn't mean that this satisfaction is the object of his desire or that he is in any way selfish on account of it. End quote. By the way, if you want to send me a fishing boat, go ahead, just to get that sense of self-satisfaction for you, but don't worry, I won't think that you're acting selfishly. This undermines argument 2 by showing the argument is not deductively valid. Even assuming the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Even if it's true that we get a pleasant state of mind when our acts are successful, it doesn't follow that we always act to bring about that nice state of mind. It's possible for the conclusion of the argument to be false, even assuming that the premises are true. It's not true that the point of action is always to achieve a pleasant state of consciousness. Rachel thinks he's shown that psychological egoism is a weak theory of why we actually do what we do. What do you think? Next time we'll look at Rachel's argument against ethical egoism. Until then, keep thinking ethically and living wisely. Keep living the philosophical life.